Today, I would like to talk about Chinese financial institutions. In Japan, there is naturally a lot of information about the Japanese economy, with media reports and highly specialized people providing information on YouTube, which I think has become even higher in quality than traditional media sources. The same goes for the American economy, where there is ample information because people rely on it as a reference. This information might be more comprehensive on YouTube than in traditional media these days. However, when it comes to the Chinese economy, the amount of information is extremely limited, and issues that have been talked about for years are only now being reported. I feel that the coverage is very biased. In China, both corporate information and that provided by the Communist Party are not very reliable, so even if television programs or YouTube content are based on the party's information, the foundation itself is flawed. As a result, experts may find it difficult to properly address such issues. That's probably why there aren't many channels dedicated to the Chinese economy in Japanese. However, there are quite a few channels in Chinese that focus on such topics, and when you watch them, you see detailed economic information about different regions of China being shared. I often watch these kinds of channels, and the information that comes from them is often the kind that would cause a big stir if even a single report was made in Japan. Today's topic is one of those instances. If financial institutions in Japan or the United States were to fail or face mergers or restructuring due to poor management, it would be a significant news story. In both Japan and the US, when financial institutions struggle, it sends a highly negative signal for the economy, and people would pay attention. However, I believe that people in Japan are largely unaware of what is happening with financial institutions in China. In China, mid-sized and small financial institutions are disappearing one after another. In fact, in just the first half of this year alone, 80 banks either merged or were restructured and disappeared. In June, at least 40 banks vanished within a single week, showing that the consolidation of Chinese financial institutions has already begun. These are small financial institutions, mostly similar to rural banks, but an extreme example is the Rural Commercial Bank in Liaoning Province. Last year, this bank absorbed 30 other small rural financial institutions, and this year alone it has already merged with over 30 more. Combining the figures for the past 2 years, the bank has absorbed more than 60 small financial institutions. Even a single bank merger would be major economic news, but in China, multiple mergers are no longer unusual. At this point, you might think that since it's just about small financial institutions, it doesn't have much of an impact. But next, I'd like to talk about the significance of these small rural financial institutions. There are about 3,800 such small financial institutions in rural China, and their combined asset scale is said to be around 55 trillion yuan. In Japanese yen, that's roughly 1 trillion yen in assets. This represents about 1% of China's entire banking sector, so while that may seem small in comparison, it's still a significant amount. The assets these banks hold are essentially loans made to various entities, and as long as the loans are repaid, the assets retain their value. However, if the loans aren't repaid, they turn into bad debts. In a society with low moral standards, the risks for banking are enormous. Banks in China have often failed because they lend money to friends and relatives without any assurance of repayment. This kind of lending leads to bad debts. In an ideal banking system, banks would lend money to promising businesses, allowing both the businesses and the banks to grow together. But in China, where human relationships dictate much of the lending, the process itself becomes a form of corruption. For example, a loan of 100 million yuan may come with a 10 million yuan kickback. Such practices create a situation where loans turn into bad debts. As I mentioned earlier, the total assets of these small banks amount to around 1 trillion yen, but we have to question how much of that is really valuable. I suspect that a large portion consists of bad debts. That's why these small financial institutions are facing management difficulties, and their consolidation is becoming increasingly common. If something like this were to happen in Japan or the US, it would be an economic disaster. However, in China, this situation is hardly reported in Japan. As the Chinese Communist Party struggles to support the economy through measures like large-scale public works funded by issuing massive amounts of government bonds, the real economy is not improving. The signs of trouble, like the failing financial institutions, are already visible. Yet, this information isn't reaching Japan. I believe that what we are seeing is the beginning of a major economic upheaval in China. Problems that have been talked about for years, such as excessive real estate development and the resulting strain on financial institutions, are starting to manifest. However, this information is not being communicated in Japan. On the other hand, The Chinese government has been issuing ultra-long-term government bonds at unprecedented levels, which are being bought up. Some people may interpret this as a sign that the Chinese economy is turning around, but the reality is that smaller institutions are being wiped out, and many industries are showing signs of decline. In conclusion, the reality of the Chinese economy is that it is deteriorating in ways that are predictable based on the country's long-standing issues. Yet, this information is severely lacking in Japan. Going forward, I plan to continue sharing detailed reports on the state of different industries and what is happening in China. That concludes today's video, and I'll see you in the next one.